My daughter looked me up and down, taking in my worn boots and faded flannel shirt, and curled her lip in disgust. "Your life is nothing to be proud of," she sneered, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so her wealthy future in-laws inside wouldn't hear. "Don't show up to the wedding." I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked away. That same afternoon, I quietly canceled every single payment, funding her lavish lifestyle, and made absolutely sure her wedding day became the most humiliating day of her life. Before I get into how I systematically dismantled her perfect facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach someone the hard way that true power doesn't need to shout. My name is Everett Calloway, though most folks around town just call me Cal. I am 69 years old, and for the last 10 years, my sanctuary has been the dusty, oil-stained garage attached to my modest 3-bedroom house. That Tuesday afternoon, the air was thick with the smell of motor oil and old leather. I was elbow-deep under the hood of my classic Chevy truck, wrestling with a stubborn alternator, perfectly at peace. My hands were coated in grease, the kind that takes days to scrub out of your cuticles, and my favorite country radio station was humming softly in the background. It was a simple, quiet existence, exactly the way I liked it. The crunch of tires on gravel broke my concentration. I wiped my forehead with the back of my wrist, leaving a dark smudge of oil across my brow, and stepped out of the garage. A gleaming leased luxury sedan pulled up my driveway, kicking up dust. The doors opened, and out stepped my 28-year-old daughter, Sloane, alongside her fiancé, Preston. Preston was 32, wore tailored suits that cost more than my first car, and worked as a junior executive at a massive commercial real estate firm downtown. He had the kind of perfectly styled hair and arrogant smirk that always made my jaw clench. "Dad? Really?" Sloane sighed as she approached, her eyes scanning my grease-stained overalls. She held her designer handbag close to her chest, as if the dirt from my driveway might somehow jump onto the pristine leather. "We are on a tight schedule. I told you we were coming." "Good to see you too, sweetheart," I replied, wiping my hands on an old rag. I looked over at Preston, who was standing a few feet back, visibly trying to avoid getting his expensive shoes dusty. "Cal?" Preston said, giving me a tight, condescending nod. He looked around my property, his gaze lingering on my old truck. "Still tinkering with that old rust bucket, huh? You know, at your age, most men are enjoying their retirement on a golf course. But I suppose there is something to be said for living a simple, uninspired life. Keeps the blood pressure down, right?" I just smiled gently. "It keeps me busy, Preston. Keeps my hands working." Sloane rolled her eyes, clearly eager to leave. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "Look, we just came to drop this off. It is the final invoice for the caterer and the country club venue. I know it is a lot, but Preston's parents have a standard to maintain, and we cannot cut corners. I need you to look it over. My grant money should clear next week, but I need you to handle the logistics." I took the envelope with a grease-stained thumb and forefinger, being careful not to smudge the pristine white paper. 150,000, I noted, feeling the weight of the envelope. "That is quite the party." "It is an investment, Cal," Preston chimed in, adjusting his cuffs. In my line of work, optics are everything. You have to project success to attract success. The partners at my firm are going to be there. The CEO might even make an appearance, though the guy is practically a ghost. It is high society, Cal. I wouldn't expect a mechanic to understand the nuances of corporate networking. I looked at Preston, maintaining my mild, unbothered smile. You are probably right, Preston. I just fix engines. What Preston did not know, what neither of them knew, was that I was not just a mechanic. Through my calm, steady breaths, I looked at this arrogant junior executive who thought he owned the world. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Callaway Commercial Real Estate, the exact firm where Preston spends his days fetching coffee and trying to claw his way up the corporate ladder. I built that empire from the ground up with my late wife Rosalind. We started with nothing but grit and a shared vision. When Rosalind passed away a decade ago, the fire for the boardroom died with her. I handed the daily operations over to a board of directors, stepped back into the shadows, and chose to live the quiet life I had always promised her we would eventually have. Sloan never knew the true extent of our wealth. Rosalind and I had decided early on that we wanted our daughter to grow up grounded, to value hard work over a trust fund. We provided a comfortable life, but we never flaunted our billions. Just make sure the invoices are sorted, Dad, Sloan said, snapping me back to reality. She was looking at me, not like a father, but like a neighborhood handyman who was taking too long to fix a leak. We have a cake tasting to get to. I will take care of it, Sloan, I said softly. As they drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, I looked down at the thick envelope. Despite their condescension, she was still my little girl. I planned to surprise them. I was going to pay off the entire $150,000 wedding as my gift to them, clearing the slate so they could start their marriage without the suffocating weight of debt. I walked inside, the screen door snapping shut behind me. My house was small, but impeccably clean. I went straight to the kitchen sink, using a heavy-duty pumice soap to scrub the grease from my hands until the skin was raw and pink. Once my hands were clean, I sat down at my modest oak dining table, put on my reading glasses, and opened the envelope. I pulled out my laptop, an old bulky machine that looked completely unassuming, and opened a highly encrypted browser. I logged into the secure portal for Rosalind Holdings. This was the blind trust I had established years ago. Through this trust, I secretly funded Sloane's lifestyle, including her luxury downtown apartment and her supposed academic grants. She believed she was winning scholarships and corporate sponsorships. She had no idea her old grease-covered father was the one silently underwriting her entire existence. I began reviewing the invoices, preparing to initiate the massive wire transfers to the wedding vendors. The catering bill was exorbitant, but mathematically sound. The florist was charging a premium, but it matched the market rate for the imported orchids Sloan wanted. But as I flipped to the venue invoice from the country club, my eyes caught something buried on the third page. It was a line item labeled Administrative and Logistics Fee, totaling $20,000. I frowned, adjusting my glasses. In all my years dealing with commercial real estate and high-end venues, I had never seen an administrative fee structured quite like this. The payment was not routed to the country club. It was payable directly to a third-party LLC. My business instincts, dormant but never dead, flared to life. I opened a new tab and ran a quick, quiet search on the LLC. The company was registered just 3 months ago. The registered agent was a generic corporate services firm designed to hide the true owner's identity. It was a classic shell company structure, the kind I had seen 100 times when auditing shady contractors in the 80s. I leaned back in my wooden chair, the silence of the kitchen pressing in on me. Why was $20,000 of wedding money being diverted to a newly formed shell company? And why did Preston personally hand me this specific invoice, with that smug look on his face? I could have picked up the phone right then. I could have called Sloan and demanded an explanation, but decades in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate had taught me one ironclad rule: never confront an anomaly until you understand the entire board. An immediate phone call would give them time to fabricate a lie. I needed to see their faces. I needed to gauge their reactions. I closed the laptop and slipped the venue invoice into the inner pocket of my faded flannel jacket. The wedding RSVP card was sitting on my counter. I decided I would deliver my RSVP in person to Sloan's apartment. I would casually bring up the administrative fee and watch how Preston reacted. I locked the front door, got into my old Chevy, and started the engine. The drive downtown took 40 minutes, the landscape shifting from quiet suburban lawns to towering glass and steel structures, the very structures I owned. Sloan's high-rise apartment building was located in the most exclusive zip code in the city. The doorman, a stiff man in a tailored uniform, eyed my scuffed boots and flannel jacket with deep suspicion, but since I was on the approved guest list, he reluctantly led me up to the penthouse floor. Stepping out of the elevator, my boots sank into the plush carpet of the corridor. As I approached Sloan's door, I could hear boisterous, wealthy voices echoing from inside. Laughter, the clinking of crystal wine glasses, and the unmistakable tone of arrogant privilege. Preston's high society parents were visiting. I raised my hand and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. The laughter inside dipped. Footsteps approached. The door cracked open, and Sloan peered out. Her face instantly dropped, the color draining from her cheeks. "Dad," she hissed, slipping out into the hallway and pulling the door shut firmly behind her. "What are you doing here?" "I brought my RSVP," I said calmly, holding up the small card. "And I had a quick question about one of the invoices you dropped off. There is a rather strange fee on the venue contract that I wanted to ask Preston about." Sloan did not look at the RSVP. She did not ask about the invoice. Instead, her eyes darted nervously up and down my outfit. She took in my worn work boots, my faded jeans, and the red flannel jacket I had owned for 15 years. Her expression twisted into a mask of profound disgust. "You cannot be here right now," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "Preston's parents are inside. They flew in from the coast. They are prominent people, Dad. They move in circles you cannot even comprehend. I am just here to drop off a card and ask a question, Sloan," I said, my voice steady, though a cold knot was forming in my stomach. No, she snapped, stepping closer, her voice dripping with venom. You do not get it. Preston's parents are high society. They think my father is a respectable retired consultant. If they see you showing up here in your cheap suits, smelling like motor oil and garage dirt, it is humiliating. Do you have any idea how hard I have worked to fit into Preston's world? I stood perfectly still. The daughter I had held in my arms, the girl I had secretly funded, protected, and loved unconditionally, was looking at me as if I were a stain on her perfect life. I am your father, I said quietly. And right now, you are an embarrassment, she shot back, crossing her arms. She took a deep breath, her eyes cold and merciless. Your life is nothing to be proud of, Dad. You have settled for mediocrity. I am marrying into a family of winners. So do me a favor. Take your RSVP and go. In fact, don't show up to the wedding at all. It is better for everyone if you just stay away. The hallway went dead silent. The faint sound of classical music and clinking glasses leaked through the heavy door behind her, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation happening in the corridor. This was the catalyst of cruelty. It was not a heat-of-the-moment argument. It was a cold, calculated amputation. She was cutting me out of her life like a diseased limb because I did not fit her aesthetic. I absorbed the ultimate betrayal. The pain in my chest was sharp, physical, but it was quickly swallowed by a profound, icy clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for her love. I did not remind her of the sacrifices her mother and I had made. I looked into her eyes and saw a stranger, a woman entirely corrupted by superficial greed. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. I slowly lowered my hand, sliding the RSVP card back into my pocket. Understood, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I will stay out of your life. I turned my back on her and walked toward the elevator. I did not look back when I heard her apartment door click shut. The emotional core of my world had just shattered. But as the elevator doors closed, shielding me from her floor, the grief evaporated. In its place rose a cold, calculated determination. She wanted a high society wedding without her worthless mechanic father. She was about to find out exactly how much her perfect life actually cost. I did not go back to my quiet suburban street. I did not return to the grease and the comfort of my garage. As the elevator doors slid shut on my daughter's floor, I felt a profound shift deep inside my chest. The paternal instinct that had governed my life for 28 years, the desperate urge to protect and provide for my little girl, completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold and absolute clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when a devastating truth is finally revealed. For years, I had played the part she wanted me to play. I let her believe the fairy tale that she was a self-made woman, thriving on prestigious academic grants and anonymous corporate sponsorships. I let her future husband strut around, treating me like a peasant, all while his paycheck was signed by a company I founded. I did it because I loved her. I did it because I wanted her to have the world, without the burden of knowing how heavy that world could be. But today, she proved that having the world had cost her her soul. I walked out of that luxury building, ignoring the sneer of the doorman. and climbed back into my old Chevy truck. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, but I did not point the hood toward home. I pointed it toward the financial district. Traffic was heavy, but I barely noticed. My mind was a steel trap clicking shut, processing every variable and every necessary step. The downtown skyline loomed ahead, a forest of glass and steel that I knew intimately. I pulled my battered truck right up to the front plaza of the towering Callaway Commercial Real Estate headquarters. It was a massive structure of reflective glass, a monument to the decades of sweat and sacrifice my late wife and I had poured into our business. The valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, rushed over, looking panicked. He clearly wanted to shoo me away, assuming I was a lost delivery driver or a confused contractor blocking the entrance for the executives. I handed him the keys and a $100 bill, telling him to park it out front and leave it exactly there. He stared at the bill and then at my faded flannel jacket, completely speechless. I walked past him and pushed through the massive revolving doors. The main lobby was a temple of polished marble and elevated ceilings. Suits and briefcases buzzed around like busy bees. The air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso. A pair of security guards stepped forward, ready to intercept the scruffy old mechanic wandering into their billionaire sanctuary. But the senior guard, an older fellow who had been with the company since the early days, grabbed his partner's arm. He recognized my face. He nodded respectfully and stepped back, clearing the path. I did not stop at the reception desk. I walked straight to the private executive elevator, swiped a master key card I had not used in over 2 years, and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride up was silent. I watched the digital numbers climb, feeling the last traces of the soft suburban father fall away. The man stepping out of this elevator was not a handyman. He was a titan, waking up from a very long sleep. The top floor was quiet, hushed by the thick carpeting and the sheer weight of serious money. I walked past a row of stunned administrative assistants. One of them stood up to stop me, but I walked right past her and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the chief financial officer's suite. Mr. Hargrove was sitting behind a massive desk, surrounded by glowing monitors, charting global markets and asset portfolios. Hargrove was a sharp, meticulous man who had managed my private wealth for over a decade. When the heavy door swung open, he frowned, ready to scold whoever dared to interrupt him. Then he saw me. He stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the paneled wall. He stammered, adjusting his glasses, saying he had not seen me in this office since the board meeting 3 years ago, and asked if everything was all right. I walked over to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down. I did not take off my jacket. I told him I needed him to pull up the master accounts for Rosalind Holdings, and my voice was low and steady. He blinked, surprised by the sudden demand, but immediately sat back down and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. He pulled up the blind trust. It was the financial engine that quietly paid for my daughter's penthouse, her designer clothes, her luxury vacations, and her extravagant lifestyle. He told me he had it right there on his screen and noted that the scheduled transfers for the wedding vendors were pending release. The venue, the florist, the caterer, were all queued up to clear by the close of business today. I told him to freeze it, to freeze the entire trust, cancel every pending transaction, and revoke all authorized credit lines. Hargrove stopped typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he looked up at me in pure disbelief. The glow from the monitors cast a pale light on his shocked face. He warned me that if he froze this account right now, those wedding checks would bounce immediately. The caterer, the florist, the country club venue, all of them would receive insufficient funds notices by tomorrow morning. I nodded slowly, looking him dead in the eye, and told him that was exactly the point. I told him to cancel them all. Hargrove swallowed hard, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the mahogany desk. He felt obligated to warn me of the severe fallout. He reminded me that I had structured this trust to automatically pay her luxury rent on the first of every month. He warned that if we locked this down, her landlord would issue an eviction notice within 48 hours. She would have zero access to the emergency credit lines. Her car lease payments would fail. She would be completely cut off, and the wedding would implode instantly because her fiancé did not have the personal funds to cover a fraction of these costs. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city I had built. I thought about my daughter standing in her expensive hallway, telling me I was an embarrassment. I thought about the utter disgust in her eyes when she looked at my work boots. She wanted to live in a high society world that she believed I was not fit to enter. She wanted to pretend her wealth came from her own brilliance and her fiancé's corporate status. She wanted me to disappear. I turned my gaze back to Hargrove and told him that my daughter had looked me in the eye today and told me my life was worthless. She had told me I was nothing to be proud of and that I should not show up to her wedding because I would humiliate her in front of her new family. Hargrove stared at me, his expression softening into an understanding shock. He knew how much I loved that girl. He knew I had built the trust so she would never struggle the way her mother and I did in the early days. He realized the magnitude of what she had done to me to push me to this point. I told him, "Let us see how much her perfect wedding is worth without me." My voice was completely void of hesitation or regret. I commanded him to shut it down, every single dime. Cut the cord right now. Hargrove did not argue anymore. He turned back to his monitors. The rapid clicking of his keyboard was the only sound in the vast office. A few keystrokes later, he pressed a final button. He told me quietly that it was done. Rosalind Holdings was completely frozen. All outbound transfers were terminated. The safety net was gone. I stood up from the chair, adjusting the collar of my flannel jacket. The trap was set. The first domino had just been pushed, and there was absolutely no turning back. I watched the green lights on Hargrove's monitors turn a harsh red as the freeze took effect. The massive financial machine that had quietly supported my daughter ground to an absolute halt. I expected to feel a sense of vindication, but instead, the room just felt cold. I was about to turn and walk out the door when Hargrove cleared his throat. He told me to wait. He was staring at the pending transactions queue, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He pointed to a specific line item that had just been rejected by the system block. It was the $20,000 administrative fee from the venue invoice. The same fee that had caught my eye earlier that afternoon in my kitchen. Hargrove tapped his pen against the desk. He said the billing structure for this specific vendor was completely irregular. Country clubs did not route administrative fees to newly incorporated shell companies with separate banking networks. He asked if I wanted him to run a hard trace on the routing numbers before he completely locked down the portal. I told him to do it. I pulled up a leather chair and sat beside him, watching the data cascade across his dual monitors. Hargrove bypassed the standard search engines and dug directly into the clearinghouse networks. Money always leaves a footprint, no matter how carefully a thief tries to sweep away their tracks. The business was registered to a generic corporate service in Nevada, a classic game designed to hide the owner. But the banking destination was a different story. The wire instructions pointed to a private wealth management account at a regional bank. Hargrove ran the account details. A few seconds later, a name appeared on the screen. Preston. My future son-in-law was not just padding his wedding budget. He was actively diverting my trust funds into his own private bank account. He was charging his own wedding and administrative fee just to put cash in his pocket. A quiet, dangerous anger settled over me. I asked Hargrove to do one more thing. I told him to cross-reference Preston's personal routing number with the internal vendor payout system for Callaway Commercial Real Estate. Preston worked in the acquisitions department, handling massive budgets for property development. If he was bold enough to steal from a blind trust, he was bold enough to steal from his employer. Hargrove's fingers flew across the keyboard. He tapped into the corporate mainframe, bridging my private wealth portfolio with the company's internal accounting network. We waited in silence as the search algorithm sifted through thousands of vendor payments from the past 2 years. The screen blinked. Then it flooded with results. Row after row of corporate payouts appeared. $5,000 here. $12,000 there, $30,000 for supposed consultation services on commercial lots that had already been developed. Every single one of those fake vendor invoices had been routed through different dummy corporations, but they all funneled down into the exact same private bank account, Preston's account. Hargrove took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He said we were looking at systematic embezzlement. Preston had been bleeding the company for at least 18 months. The stolen funds totaled well over $400,000. I stared at the numbers, scrolling past my reflection in the monitor. Suddenly, the image of Preston standing in my driveway made perfect sense. The expensive tailored suits, the leased luxury sedan, the designer watches he flaunted. None of it was earned. He was a fraud. He was funding his entire high society lifestyle with money he was stealing from my life's work. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. The faint scent of paper and polished wood in the office faded, and for a brief moment I was transported back to a warm summer evening many years ago. My late wife Rosalind and I were sitting on our back porch, watching a teenage Sloane get into a sports car with a neighborhood boy who had more ego than sense. Rosalind had rested her head on my shoulder and sighed softly. She told me that she worried about our daughter. She said Sloane was blinded by fool's gold. She warned me that Sloane was drawn to boys who loved the appearance of wealth far more than the character required to build it. Rosalind had known, even back then, that our daughter confused a heavy wallet with a good man. I opened my eyes, the memory fading back into the cold reality of the boardroom. Rosalind had been entirely right. Sloane had not just chosen an arrogant snob. She had chosen a common thief. She had chosen a man who looked me in the eye, insulted my simple life, and called me uninspired, all while wearing clothes paid for by the money he stole from my company. Hargrove broke the silence. He reached for his office phone and asked if he should call the police. He stated that we had enough digital evidence to have Preston arrested for corporate fraud before the day was over. I placed my hand over the phone, pressing it back into the receiver. I told Hargrove to wait. An immediate arrest would be too quiet. It would happen behind closed doors. Sloane would inevitably spin the story, blaming the company, playing the victim, and finding a way to excuse Preston's behavior. She would say the corporate world was just too cutthroat, or that he made a simple accounting error. I knew my daughter. She would protect her high society illusion at all costs. I stood up from the desk. I told Hargrove that we were not going to call the police today. I told him we were going to let Preston believe he was getting away with it. We were going to let him dress up in his expensive tuxedo, stand in front of his arrogant parents, and prepare to marry my daughter. We were going to let the pressure build until he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Preston thought my life was nothing to be proud of. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, outsmarting a grease-stained mechanic. He had no idea that the mechanic he just banned from the wedding was the CEO of his company, the owner of his stolen funds, and the man who was about to dismantle his entire existence. The financial freeze was already in motion. The wedding checks would bounce by morning. Preston's stolen money was about to dry up, and his panic would force him into the light. I told Hargrove to prepare a full corporate audit, to wrap every piece of this embezzlement into an undeniable legal trap, and to have it ready for the end of the week. I walked out of the office, leaving the glowing screens behind. The silence of the hallway felt different now. It was the calm before a very intentional storm. Preston and Sloane had demanded I stay out of their perfect world, but they were about to learn that I was the only thing holding their world together, and I had just pulled out the foundation. Hargrove still had his hand hovering over the heavy receiver of his desk phone. He looked at me with the kind of urgent, nervous energy you expect from a financial officer who has just uncovered a massive corporate theft. He insisted that we call the authorities right this second. He said we had all the digital routing numbers, the forged invoices, and the offshore transfers nicely tied up in a neat digital bow. He wanted to see Preston in handcuffs before the sun went down. It was the logical, responsible thing to do. It was exactly what any normal chief executive would do. But I was not just a chief executive facing a thief. I was a father facing a profound betrayal. I told Hargrove to take his hand off the phone. He blinked, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. I explained that an immediate arrest was the worst possible move we could make. If the police quietly picked Preston up at his office on a random Tuesday afternoon, my daughter would immediately control the narrative. She would paint herself as the tragic heroine of the story. She would say her brilliant fiancé was framed by jealous co-workers, or that it was a simple accounting misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by a cutthroat corporate machine. Since she was a teenager, Sloane had always possessed a remarkable talent for rewriting history to suit her needs. She would excuse his criminal behavior, cover for him, and spend the rest of her life playing the victim. She had spent years perfecting the art of building false realities. If I simply handed Preston over to the police behind closed doors, she would never see the truth. She would just blame the world for ruining her fairy tale. To truly break a delusion, you cannot just crack the glass. You have to wait until they build their glass house as high as it will possibly go, and then you pull the foundation out from under it. I needed the destruction of her illusion to be absolute, public, and utterly undeniable. I needed her to see the man she chose over her own father exactly for what he was, with no shadows to hide in and no excuses left to make. I turned to Hargrove and told him we were going to initiate a full external corporate audit. I did not want an internal review conducted by people Preston might know or manipulate. I wanted independent, ruthless auditors who answered to no one but the board of directors and the federal financial regulators. I instructed him to hire the most aggressive accounting firm in the city. They were to tear through the entire acquisitions department, pulling every file, every expense report, and every vendor contract Preston had touched over the last 2 years. Hargrove nodded slowly, the realization of what I was doing washing over his face. He noted that an external audit of that magnitude would be incredibly aggressive, and it would put immense pressure on Preston. As the auditors got closer to his department, Preston would feel the walls closing in. He would be sitting in his glass office, watching the accountants move from desk to desk, knowing they were looking for missing money. He would know they were coming for him, but he would not be able to stop them. That was precisely the point. The psychological squeeze was going to be excruciating for him. But the most important part of my plan was the timeline. I leaned over the heavy mahogany desk and gave Hargrove very specific instructions on how to schedule the auditors. I told him they were to work around the clock, mapping out every stolen dollar, building an ironclad case of embezzlement and fraud, but they were not to finalize the compliance report until the end of the week. Hargrove looked at his calendar and asked what exact day I wanted the final legally binding report issued to the authorities. I looked him dead in the eye and said, Saturday. Not just Saturday, but specifically Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hargrove swallowed hard. He knew exactly what was happening on Saturday afternoon. That was the exact moment my daughter was scheduled to walk down the aisle in her $15,000 dress. That was the exact moment Preston would be standing at the altar, surrounded by 200 high society guests, pretending to be a wealthy, successful executive. The trap was meticulously designed. By the time the wedding march played, the blind trust checks would have already bounced, sending Preston into a blind panic to find money to pay the angry vendors. He would be sweating through his tailored suit, desperate to keep up appearances. And right when he thought he had managed to hide his crimes and marry into a wealthy lifestyle, the audit would drop like an anvil. I stood up from the desk, smoothing out the collar of my worn flannel jacket. I told Hargrove that I wanted the auditors to prepare a physical copy of that final report. I wanted it printed, sealed in a heavy manila folder, and handed directly to me on Saturday morning. Hargrove agreed. his voice filled with a mixture of awe and intimidation. He promised that the trap would be set exactly as I had commanded. No one in the company would know that I was the one pulling the strings. To the rest of the world, and especially to Preston, the audit would look like a random, terrible stroke of bad luck. To Sloane, I would remain the invisible mechanic, the embarrassing father who was not invited to the party. They would have no idea that the man they had banished from their lives was the architect of their downfall. I walked out of the towering corporate building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sun. The city hummed with life around me, completely unaware of the massive financial trap that had just been armed. I climbed into my battered Chevy truck and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. For the first time in weeks, my chest did not feel heavy. There was no more sorrow over the daughter I had lost. There was only a calm, clinical determination. Preston and Sloane had wanted me to stay out of their perfect world. They were about to learn that their perfect world only existed because I allowed it to. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the old engine roar to life. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to make sure they felt every single second of it. The drive back from the glass and steel of the financial district to the quiet, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood felt like crossing between two different dimensions. I rolled the windows of the Chevy all the way down, letting the warm afternoon breeze wash over me. I listened to the steady hum of the engine, a sound I had tuned with my own two hands. There was no rage left in my blood, just a profound quiet. I pulled into my short concrete driveway, turned off the ignition, and stepped out into the peaceful suburban silence. This was the life I had chosen, a life of quiet dignity. I walked up my driveway, but I did not go inside my empty house. Instead, I grabbed my battered red toolbox from the bed of the truck and walked next door. My neighbor Nora was a 72-year-old widow with a heart of absolute gold and a front porch that had been sagging for the better part of a year. I had promised her last week that I would reinforce the support beams, and today felt like the perfect day to keep a promise. I needed to work with my hands. I needed to feel the honest weight of a hammer and the rough texture of untreated wood to wash away the sterile corporate greed I had just been swimming in. Nora opened her screen door with a bright, welcoming smile. She was wearing a faded floral apron, and her hands were covered in flour from baking. She scolded me playfully for working on a hot afternoon, but her eyes were filled with genuine gratitude. I crawled under the wooden structure of her porch, measuring the rotted beams and cutting fresh lumber to brace the foundation. The physical labor was deeply comforting. Sawdust coated my flannel jacket and sweat stung my eyes, but I felt an immense sense of peace. This was real work. This was helping a neighbor simply because it was the right thing to do. There were no hidden agendas here, no administrative fees routed to shell companies, no desperate grasping for status. As I drove the heavy galvanized nails into the fresh wood, I thought about the stark difference between my world and the world my daughter was so desperate to belong to. Sloane believed that wealth was measured by the label on a dress or the zip code of a penthouse. She thought my grease-stained hands were a symbol of failure, but lying in the dirt under a sagging porch, I knew the absolute truth. True wealth is not a bank account balance. True wealth is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror without a single ounce of shame. It is the freedom to sit in silence without the suffocating weight of debt or the exhausting performance of pretending to be someone you are not. I had millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts and corporate trusts, but my real fortune was the quiet integrity of this exact moment. After 2 hours of solid work, the porch was level and sturdy. I packed up my tools and brushed the dirt from my jeans. Nora insisted I sit in a wicker chair under the shade of her awning. She brought out 2 tall glasses of sweet iced tea, clinking with fresh ice cubes, and a plate of warm oatmeal cookies. We sat together, listening to the distant sound of a lawnmower and the gentle rustle of the oak leaves above us. Nora talked about her grandchildren, who called her every Sunday just to hear her voice. She told me how her grandson had driven 3 hours just to help her plant a small vegetable garden in her backyard. She did not have a dime to her name to give them, but they loved her fiercely anyway. I smiled, listening to her, realizing just how bankrupt my own daughter truly was. Sloane had everything handed to her on a silver platter, and yet she threw her own father away because he did not fit her aesthetic. Nora had nothing but a sagging porch and a warm kitchen, and she was the richest woman on the block. I took a long sip of the cold, sweet tea, feeling the condensation drip down the glass onto my rough fingers. It was an idyllic, serene afternoon. The world felt perfectly balanced. Then the heavy silence in my pocket vibrated. My cell phone let out a short, sharp buzz, then another, and another. A rapid succession of notifications breaking through the suburban tranquility. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old phone. The screen was lit up with automated alerts forwarded directly from the secure portal of Rosalind Holdings. I stared at the glowing text, reading the digital confirmation of the carnage I had unleashed. Insufficient funds, transfer denied, account frozen. The massive payment to the country club had bounced. The wire transfer to the luxury florist had been rejected by the clearinghouse. The catering deposit had failed. The payments for her luxury apartment lease were blocked. Every single financial pillar holding up my daughter's perfect high society lifestyle had just been brutally kicked out from under her. I slowly locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just took another calm bite of my oatmeal cookie and looked out at the quiet suburban street. The first domino had officially fallen. Right now, across town in her subsidized luxury apartment, my daughter was probably receiving a very confusing phone call from her wedding planner. The invisible safety net she had taken for granted her entire life was gone. The calm before the storm had passed, and the financial hurricane was about to make landfall. I leaned back in the wicker chair, sipping my tea, and waited for the panic to begin. I did not have to be inside my daughter's luxury penthouse to know exactly how the panic unfolded. The digital alerts from Mr. Hargrove told the entire story. On Tuesday morning, the country club venue manager submitted a hard inquiry. The initial deposit had bounced. By Tuesday afternoon, the luxury florist and the high-end caterer had received the same insufficient funds notices. The vendors were ruthless. In the world of high society weddings, Money talks and empty promises walk. They gave Sloan 48 hours to produce $150,000 in cleared funds, or her perfect day would be canceled entirely. I listened to the frantic voicemails Sloan started leaving on the secure helpline for Rosalind Holdings. The trust had a dedicated phone number managed by a corporate service designed to answer her questions and handle her supposed grant disbursements. I had access to the recorded logs. Her first call was polite but strained. She assumed it was a simple banking glitch. She explained that her wedding vendors were threatening to release her date and asked the customer service team to expedite the wire transfers. When no one called her back, she dialed again and again. Her voice grew higher and more desperate. By her fifth call, the polite facade had completely melted away. She demanded to speak to a supervisor. She yelled that she was a top-tier academic recipient and that this delay was unacceptable. But there were no supervisors left to answer. I had instructed Hargrove to disconnect the human operators. On her sixth attempt, Sloan was met with a cold, automated voice. The recording stated clearly that the account associated with her portfolio had been permanently closed. All associated funds were revoked. The balance was zero. I could only imagine the blood draining from her face as she dropped the phone. The invisible magic wand that had paid her luxury rent, bought her designer clothes, and funded her extravagant lifestyle was gone. She was staring at a six-figure wedding bill with absolutely no way to pay it. And then there was Preston. My future son-in-law was trapped in his own private nightmare. He was not just losing a free wedding. He was losing the $20,000 administrative fee he had tried to steal through his shell company. But his greed was entirely eclipsed by his ego. He had invited the senior partners from Callaway Commercial Real Estate to this wedding. He had invited his wealthy, arrogant parents, who boasted to all their country club friends about their son's lavish lifestyle. If the venue canceled the wedding due to bounced checks, Preston would be exposed as a fraud. His reputation in the high society circles he worshipped would be destroyed overnight. Panic is a very dangerous thing. It makes arrogant men believe they are invincible, right up until the moment they step off the cliff. Sitting in my quiet garage, I received a secure message from Hargrove. The digital trap we had set at the corporate office had just been triggered. Preston was sitting at his glass desk at the commercial real estate firm, sweating through his designer suit. The vendors were demanding immediate payment by wire transfer. Preston knew he did not have the personal funds. His parents had already told him their money was tied up in investments. He had absolutely nowhere to turn. Driven by a toxic mixture of desperation and immense pride, he made the fatal mistake I was counting on. He logged into the corporate acquisitions portal. This was the same portal he had been using to slowly bleed the company for the past 18 months. But stealing $5,000 here and there was one thing. Stealing $150,000 in a single afternoon to pay a country club and a wedding caterer was financial suicide. Preston did not care. He was drowning, and he reached for the biggest life preserver he could find. He drafted a massive wire transfer, routing the stolen corporate funds through a complex web of vendor accounts, trying to disguise the payment as a legitimate property development expense. He hit submit, thinking he was a genius. He thought he could move the money, cover the wedding vendors, and somehow shuffle the accounts later to hide his tracks. He had no idea that he had just walked right into the jaws of a trap. Every single keystroke he made was being monitored. The aggressive external auditors I had hired were already inside the corporate network. They were watching his digital footprint in real time. They documented the fake invoices. They traced the routing numbers. They captured his login credentials. The moment Preston pressed the button to wire the stolen funds to the country club, the auditors locked down the evidence. Hargrove called me a few minutes later. His voice was thick with disbelief. He told me that Preston had actually done it. He had initiated a massive, reckless transfer of company funds directly to the wedding venue. The audacity of the theft was staggering. Hargrove asked if the bank should stop the wire from clearing. I wiped a smudge of oil from my hands and looked out the garage window. I told Hargrove to let the wire go through. I told him to let the money hit the country club account so the vendors would keep the wedding date secure. The venue needed to believe they were paid so the party would proceed exactly as planned. But I also told Hargrove to immediately notify the federal financial authorities. The bank would quietly flag the wire as part of an active criminal investigation. Preston believed he had saved his wedding. He believed he had outsmarted the system and secured his perfect high society day. He was going to put on his tuxedo and smile for the cameras, completely unaware that the money he used to buy that smile was about to send him to federal prison. The financial cascade had done its job. It had forced the thief into the light, and the final stage of the execution was now firmly in place. The sun had already dipped below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across my driveway. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, watching the evening news with the volume turned down low. The house was perfectly still. Then my cell phone began to ring. The bright screen illuminated the dim kitchen, displaying my daughter's name. I did not pick it up right away. I let it ring. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat, and counted the rings. On the fifth ring, I finally pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say hello, I just waited. The sound that came through the speaker was not the arrogant, polished voice of the high society bride I had seen in that luxury apartment hallway. It was the frantic, hyperventilating sobbing of a woman whose entire universe was burning to the ground. She was crying so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. She gasped for air between her words, her voice pitched high with absolute panic. She told me her academic grant had been terminated. She said her bank accounts were overdrawn, and her landlord had taped an eviction warning to her front door. The caterer was threatening to sue her, and the luxury travel agency had canceled her non-refundable honeymoon to the Maldives. She was drowning. Then came the desperate plea. She asked me if I knew anyone who could help. She begged me to think of some wealthy client whose cars I might have fixed over the years, or some local business owner who could write a private loan. She demanded to know if I had any way to borrow $100,000 immediately to cover the remaining wedding costs and save her from total ruin. I sat in my quiet kitchen listening to her weep. A month ago, the sound of my daughter crying would have moved mountains. I would have moved heaven and earth to fix her problems. I would have drained my own accounts, sold my truck, and worked my hands to the bone just to see her smile again. But that version of me died the moment she looked at my work boots in disgust and told me I was an embarrassment to her existence. I kept my voice completely flat, devoid of any warmth or paternal comfort. I told her I did not understand why she was asking me for that kind of money. I reminded her exactly of what she had told me. I said, I am just a simple mechanic. I told her I spend my days covered in grease and motor oil. I said, I do not move in the elite wealthy circles that she and Preston belong to. I calmly repeated her own devastating words back to her. I told her my life is nothing to be proud of, so it was completely illogical for her to think a useless old man like me could produce $100,000. The line went dead silent. The sobbing stopped instantly, replaced by a stunned, breathless void. She realized I was throwing her cruelty right back in her face. She realized I was not going to be her safety net. When she finally spoke, the panic had morphed into a blinding, vicious rage. She screamed into the phone. She called me a failure. She yelled that a real father would find a way to save his daughter's dream instead of acting bitter and useless. She blamed me for not working harder, for settling for mediocrity, for not being the wealthy, powerful man she needed me to be right now. She cursed at me, with a venom so toxic it would have destroyed me a few weeks ago. Now it just proved my point. She slammed the phone down so hard, the line popped and disconnected. I lowered the phone and set it gently on the wooden table. I felt a deep, resonant peace. The boundary had been drawn and held, but the fallout of that phone call did not end in my kitchen. The psychological destruction was just beginning to take root across town. Even though I was miles away, the digital alerts from the corporate audit team painted a very clear picture of the fracture happening inside her luxury apartment. Sloane was backed into a corner, with no money, no father to bail her out, and an eviction notice looming over her head. She turned all her frantic energy and rage toward the only person left in her life, Preston. She demanded he fix it. She demanded he tap into his savings, ask his arrogant parents, or take out a massive personal loan to save their social standing. But Preston was already suffocating under the weight of his own terrible decisions. He had just wired a massive sum of stolen corporate money to the country club venue to secure the ballroom. He thought he had stopped the bleeding, but Sloane was screaming at him about the remaining debts. The caterer, the florist, the travel agent, and the landlord were all circling like vultures. Preston could not steal any more money. He knew that pulling another $100,000 from the corporate accounts so soon after the first massive wire would instantly trigger the internal security systems at the commercial real estate firm. He was trapped. He was pacing the floor of their apartment, sweating bullets, jumping at every sound in the hallway. He was obsessively refreshing his banking apps, terrified that the federal authorities were already preparing a warrant for his arrest. The pressure was enormous, and it caused their perfect high society relationship to fracture violently. They were no longer the wealthy power couple boasting about their elite status. They were two desperate, terrified people turning on each other like wild animals trapped in a cage. Preston snapped at Sloane, telling her she was spending too much money and obsessing over pointless details. Sloane screamed back, accusing him of not being the successful provider he pretended to be. She told him he was failing her. He told her she was a spoiled brat. The facade was dissolving into a toxic mess of blame and desperation. They were sleeping in separate rooms. They were drinking heavily to numb the panic. Preston was losing sleep, showing up to the corporate office with dark circles under his eyes, paranoid that every email from the finance department was a notification of his impending arrest. He was jumping every time his desk phone rang. He was watching the external auditors walk down the office corridors, completely unaware that those auditors were hand-picked by his future father-in-law to build his prison cell. The emotional toll was breaking them down from the inside out. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of wealth, and without my money to prop them up, they had absolutely nothing left but their own ugly, shallow greed. The stage was perfectly set. They were bruised, paranoid, and financially ruined. All that remained was the final devastating blow. I finished my coffee, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed, knowing that Saturday was going to be a very memorable day. The afternoon heat had settled into the concrete of my garage. I was standing at my workbench, polishing a carburetor piece, just enjoying the rhythmic, repetitive motion. The silence of the neighborhood was suddenly broken by the aggressive screech of tires. A car jerked to a halt right at the edge of my driveway. I set down my polishing cloth and watched as the driver door swung open. It was Preston, the junior executive who usually looked like he stepped out of a luxury magazine catalog, was completely coming apart at the seams. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose, his collar was unbuttoned, and dark sweat stains soaked the underarms of his tailored shirt. His hair, usually slicked perfectly into place, was a chaotic mess. He looked exactly like a man who felt the walls of a federal prison closing in on him. He practically stumbled up the driveway, clutching a leather portfolio. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, revealing the sheer panic vibrating underneath his skin. "Cal," he breathed heavily, stopping at the threshold of my garage. "I am so glad you are home. I really need to talk to you, man to man." I picked up a shop rag and slowly wiped the grease from my fingers. I did not invite him in. I just leaned against my workbench and looked at him. I asked him what he wanted. Preston swallowed hard. His eyes darted around my messy garage, taking in the old tools and the concrete floor, as if he was searching for a lifeline in a dumpster. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, trying to sound intimate and conspiratorial. "Look, Cal," he started, his hands trembling slightly. "Sloane is an absolute wreck. The wedding is falling apart because of some stupid banking error with her academic grant. You know how much this day means to her. It is her dream. And as the men in her life, we have a duty to step up and fix it." I tossed the rag onto the bench. I told him I had already explained to Sloane that I did not have $100,000 lying around. Preston took a step closer, invading my space. The smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat rolled off him. "I know you do not have cash," he said quickly, "but you have this house." I ran the numbers, Cal. The property values in this neighborhood have skyrocketed. You own this place outright. You could easily take out a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit. The bank would approve it by tomorrow morning if we pushed them. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his request hang in the humid air. He was standing in my garage, asking me to leverage my home, the house where I had lived with my late wife, the house where I had raised my daughter, just to fund a single day of high society pretending. He wanted me to put my shelter at risk, to pay off vendors, because he had already stolen all he could from my company and was desperate to cover his tracks. I looked him right in the eye. I told him I was not going to take out a mortgage on my home to pay for country club appetizers and imported flowers. I said the answer is absolutely no. The forced smile on Preston's face instantly vanished. The fake camaraderie evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated venom. The corner of his mouth twitched. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh and ran a shaking hand through his ruined hair. He stepped right up to my face, his voice dropping into a vicious sneer. "You are pathetic. Do you know that?" he spat out. "Sloan told me you were a failure, but I did not realize you were this useless. Your own daughter is begging for help to save the most important day of her life, and you will not even sign a piece of paper. You are a useless old man who failed his family." He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You are going to die in this filthy garage reeking of oil, and nobody is going to care. You are mediocre, Cal. You have always been mediocre, and Sloan deserves 1,000 times better than the pathetic excuse for a father she got stuck with." He stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to explode. He expected me to yell, to throw a punch, to act like the uneducated blue-collar stereotype he believed me to be. But I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I just looked at this desperate, sweating thief who thought he was a titan of industry. I thought about the massive external audit currently tearing through his department at Callaway Commercial Real Estate. I thought about the federal authorities analyzing his forged wire transfers at this very second. I thought about the absolute devastation waiting for him on Saturday afternoon. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap snap shut. I told him softly that he was absolutely right. I said, "I am just a simple mechanic, and I will stay right here in my garage." I told him to go ahead and run along, back to his corporate office. I wished him the best of luck with his financial problems. Preston recoiled slightly, unsettled by my total lack of anger. My cold smile clearly unnerved him, but his massive ego would not let him understand why. He scoffed, shaking his head in absolute disgust. He muttered that I was a waste of breath, turned on his heel, and stormed down the driveway. He got back into his leased luxury sedan, slammed the door, and sped off down the street, running a stop sign in his desperate rush to escape. I stood in the doorway of my garage, watching the red taillights disappear around the corner. The smile lingered on my face. He truly believed he had just insulted a broke, useless old man. He had absolutely no idea that he had just screamed at the chief executive officer of his company. He did not know that he had just verbally attacked the sole owner of the funds he had stolen. He had just sealed his own fate with arrogant pride. I turned off the garage lights and walked into my house. The final pieces were perfectly in place. It was time to go buy a tuxedo. 48 hours before the ceremony, I found myself sitting in a windowless conference room, deep inside the downtown precinct of the Financial Crimes Division. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone that matched the quiet intensity in the room. I was no longer wearing my grease-stained flannel. I had put on a clean button-down shirt and a modest sport coat. It was a subtle shift, but an important one. Sitting across from me were two seasoned federal detectives and a senior prosecutor. To my right sat Mr. Hargrove, my chief financial officer, looking sharper than a razor blade. He had brought two thick leather-bound binders, filled with the complete findings of the external audit. We were not dealing in suspicions or hunches anymore. We were dealing in absolute, indisputable mathematics. Hargrove pushed the first binder across the polished table. He opened it to a highlighted page detailing the massive wire transfer Preston had initiated just a few days prior. He walked the detectives through the entire digital breadcrumb trail. He showed them how Preston had accessed the corporate acquisitions portal, bypassed the secondary security protocols using stolen credentials, and routed $150,000 of company money through 3 separate dummy corporations before finally aiming it straight at the country club venue. The lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman who had spent 20 years chasing white-collar thieves, traced her finger along the printed routing numbers. She let out a low whistle of disbelief. She noted that thieves usually try to hide their stolen money in offshore accounts or cryptocurrency, but Preston had literally wired stolen corporate funds to pay for his own wedding reception. She called it a breathtaking display of arrogance and stupidity. I sat back in my chair and watched them work. I told the detective that arrogance is exactly what makes a man sloppy. I explained that he was desperate to save his high society facade, and desperation breeds fatal mistakes. The prosecutor reviewed the summary page and nodded. He confirmed that they had more than enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant for felony embezzlement and wire fraud. He said it was a slam-dunk case. But then he looked up from the file and frowned, addressing a complication that made my heart beat a little faster. He explained the bureaucratic reality of the banking system. The massive wire transfer Preston had authorized was currently suspended in a digital holding pattern within the Federal Clearinghouse. To legally seize the stolen funds and reverse the transaction back to Callaway Commercial Real Estate, the prosecutor needed a federal judge to sign a specific asset freeze order. The judge assigned to this jurisdiction was out of town until Friday night. The prosecutor folded his hands on the table and looked me dead in the eye. He said the freeze order would absolutely be signed, but it would not hit the banking network until the financial institutions opened their doors for weekend processing. He told me the funds would be officially seized and pulled from the country club's pending ledger on Saturday morning. He apologized for the delay, warning me that it meant the arrest warrant could not be executed until Saturday afternoon. He thought he was giving me bad news. He thought I would be frustrated that the thief stealing from my company was getting 2 more days of freedom. I did not show any frustration. I felt a slow, deep wave of profound satisfaction wash over me. I looked at Hargrove, and Hargrove looked at me. He knew exactly what Saturday meant. I turned back to the prosecutor and kept my voice remarkably calm. I told him that Saturday was perfectly fine. I said that Saturday morning was the exact right time for the bank to pull the money away from the venue. I told the detectives to take their time and execute the arrest warrant on Saturday afternoon. I assured them I knew exactly where the suspect would be standing. We concluded the meeting with firm handshakes. The legal trap was now fully armed and entirely out of my hands. It was an unstoppable machine, hurtling toward the wedding day. I walked out of the precinct into the bright city sunlight. Hargrove walked beside me, carrying the empty binders. He stopped on the sidewalk and asked me how I was feeling. He asked if I was ready for what was about to happen. I looked at the towering glass skyscrapers surrounding us. I told Hargrove that I had spent the last 10 years hiding in the shadows, trying to be a simple man for a daughter who despised simplicity. I said I was completely done hiding. Hargrove smiled a sharp, knowing smile. He asked me what my plans were for the rest of the day. I told him I needed to go shopping. I shook his hand and walked away from the precinct, heading toward the most exclusive luxury retail district in the city. For a decade, I had bought my clothes at hardware stores and discount outlets. I had worn scuffed boots and faded jeans because they were comfortable and because they kept me grounded. But Sloane had looked at those clothes and seen a worthless embarrassment. She told me my cheap suits were a humiliation. She demanded I stay away from her high society in-laws because I did not look the part. I walked into the most prestigious bespoke tailor shop in the district. The showroom was lined with rich mahogany wood and smelled of imported wool and fine leather. The floor manager, a man impeccably dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit, initially looked at me with a polite but highly dismissive expression. He took in my modest sport coat and my rough hands, clearly calculating how quickly he could usher me back out the door. He approached me and asked if I was lost or looking for a delivery entrance. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a heavy, solid black corporate card. It was the premier executive card for Callaway Commercial Real Estate, carrying my name and my title as Chief Executive Officer. I placed it gently on the glass display counter. I told him I was not lost. I told him I needed a master-crafted tuxedo tailored to my exact measurements, and I needed it rushed for a very important event this Saturday. The manager's eyes darted from my face to the heavy black card resting on the glass. The dismissive posture instantly vanished completely, replaced by a frantic, eager subservience. He bowed his head slightly, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding, and immediately called for the master tailor. For the next 2 hours, I stood in front of a three-way mirror as a team of tailors measured, pinned, and adjusted the finest midnight blue wool I had ever felt. The fabric was incredibly light, yet structured perfectly, wrapping around my shoulders like armor. They brought me a crisp white silk shirt, a hand-tied bow tie, and a pair of polished leather Oxford shoes that gleamed under the showroom lights. As I looked at my reflection, I saw the physical transformation taking place. The blue-collar disguise was peeling away, falling to the floor with every pin the tailor adjusted. The soft, quiet suburban handyman was gone. The man staring back at me in the mirror was a titan of industry. He looked sharp, ruthless, and entirely unbothered by the opinions of superficial people. My daughter had demanded a high society wedding. She had demanded an atmosphere of absolute luxury, and she had banned her own father because she thought he would ruin the aesthetic. I looked at the sleek midnight blue tuxedo and smiled a cold, hard smile. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I was going to show up to her wedding looking like the billionaire I truly was, and I was going to wear this beautiful suit while I watched her entire fraudulent world burn to the ground. Saturday arrived with a mocking perfection. The sky over the sprawling country club was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Valets in crisp white shirts scrambled across the circular driveway, parking a parade of imported luxury cars. The manicured lawns stretched out like endless carpets of green velvet, leading up to a grand ballroom decorated with thousands of imported white roses. It was exactly the kind of high society spectacle my daughter had always believed she deserved. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate triumph of wealth and status. But underneath the expensive silk and the crystal chandeliers, it was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Inside the sprawling bridal suite, Sloane stood in front of a gilded mirror, wearing a $15,000 gown covered in hand-stitched lace. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She smiled for the photographer and laughed lightly with her bridesmaids, but her eyes were tight with an exhausting hidden panic. The invisible safety net she had relied on her entire life had vanished completely. She knew her luxury apartment was gone. She knew her trust fund was frozen. She was walking down the aisle completely blind, praying that the desperate financial promises her fiancé had made her would somehow magically hold their crumbling world together. She pasted on a brave face, desperate to convince everyone in the room that she belonged in this elite circle. She had banned her own father to protect this flawless aesthetic, and now she was terrified that the cracks were beginning to show. Downstairs in the grand ballroom, the groom was quietly falling apart. Preston was standing near a towering ice sculpture, gripping a crystal flute of champagne like it was a life preserver. It was barely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was already on his 4th glass. His tailored tuxedo jacket felt like a straitjacket. While the string quartet played softly in the corner, Preston was obsessively staring at his cell phone screen. His thumb swiped down, refreshing his banking application every 30 seconds. He was checking the status of the massive, fraudulent wire transfer he had initiated earlier in the week. He had used stolen corporate funds to pay the venue manager and save the reception, but the transaction had been stuck in a digital holding pattern since Thursday. He was sweating profusely, terrified that the country club accounting office would not see the cleared funds by the time the reception officially began. Every time the venue manager walked past with a clipboard, Preston stiffened his shoulders, expecting to be tapped on the arm and thrown out into the street. He swallowed the rest of his champagne, his eyes darting around the room, trapped in a prison of his own making. The walls of his lies were closing in on him, but he forced himself to smile whenever a guest walked by. Preston's parents were holding court in the center of the room, completely oblivious to their son's impending felony arrest. His father and mother were dressed in their absolute best, soaking up the attention of the 200 high society guests they had invited to witness their family triumph. They stood near the cascading floral arrangements, holding expensive cocktails and boasting loudly to anyone who would listen. They were the picture of arrogant privilege. His mother bragged endlessly about the exclusive designer who had crafted the wedding gown, ensuring everyone knew exactly how much money the event was supposed to cost. His father loudly praised his son's brilliant trajectory in the commercial real estate market. They spoke to the senior partners from my firm, telling them that Preston was a financial prodigy destined to take over the corporate world. They puffed out their chests, completely unaware that the very success they were bragging about was entirely funded by criminal embezzlement. They reveled in the illusion of superiority, looking down their noses at anyone who did not share their tax bracket. They were so proud of the lie they had cultivated that they could not see the massive storm clouds gathering right above their heads. The guests mingled and laughed, clinking their expensive glasses and celebrating a union built entirely on theft and deception. The string quartet transitioned into a lively classical piece, and the servers began carrying out trays of expensive appetizers. It was a masterpiece of superficial perfection, but the financial deadline was ticking down rapidly. The venue manager, a stern man in a dark suit, stood near the main entrance, tapping a pen against his clipboard. He looked over at Preston with a sharp, expectant gaze. The country club had a strict policy regarding outstanding balances, and the final payment had not yet posted to their ledger. Preston saw the manager looking at him and felt a cold drop of sweat roll down his spine. Preston checked his phone one more time, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped the expensive device on the polished marble floor. The wire transfer still read pending. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, completely unaware that the federal authorities had already intercepted the money. He thought he was just waiting on a slow banking system to release the funds. He thought if he could just buy a few more hours, he could secure his new wealthy lifestyle forever. He had absolutely no idea that the money was never going to clear. He had no idea that the federal warrants were already signed and sealed. And most importantly, he had absolutely no idea that the man he had insulted in a dirty garage, the man he had banished from this pristine venue, was currently stepping out of a chauffeured town car just outside the main gates, preparing to walk through the front doors. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering crystal and soft candlelight. The string quartet had transitioned into an elegant waltz, signaling the official start of the reception. Waiters in pristine white coats circled the polished floor, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. The guests were finding their seats at round tables adorned with towering imported white orchids. A gentle hum of wealthy conversation echoed against the vaulted ceilings. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society elegance, just as my daughter had always demanded. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance swung open. They did not just open. They were pushed wide apart with a slow, deliberate force that commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the back of the room. The sound of the heavy brass hinges groaning echoed loudly over the soft classical music. Heads began to turn. Conversations trailed off into a confused, awkward silence. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the grand ballroom. I was not wearing the faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots my daughter despised. I was not covered in the motor oil she found so profoundly humiliating. I was wearing a flawless midnight blue, bespoke tuxedo. The fine Italian wool caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, draping across my shoulders with razor-sharp precision. My white silk shirt was immaculate. My leather Oxford shoes gleamed against the hardwood floor. I did not look like a neighborhood mechanic sneaking into a luxury party where he did not belong. I looked like a man who owned the entire building. Walking one step behind my right shoulder was Mr. Hargrove. My chief financial officer looked incredibly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a thick sealed manila folder under his arm. He scanned the room with the clinical, detached gaze of a corporate executioner. We walked forward with a slow, rhythmic pace, moving through the sea of tables with absolute, unyielding authority. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. A ripple of whispers washed over the room, spreading from table to table. The high society guests did not recognize me as the father of the bride. To them, I was a powerful stranger, interrupting their exclusive gathering. The string quartet faltered, losing their tempo as the musicians noticed the shifting atmosphere. The elegant waltz faded into a heavy, discordant silence. At the head table, nestled behind a massive arrangement of white roses, Sloane finally looked up. I watched the exact moment her eyes locked onto mine. First, there was a flicker of pure confusion. She saw a wealthy, distinguished older man walking into her reception. Then the recognition hit her. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and terrified. But the terror quickly morphed into a blinding, furious rage. She did not see the powerful titan of industry commanding the room. Her deeply ingrained arrogance blinded her to the reality standing right in front of her. She only saw the father she had banished, the blue-collar embarrassment who dared to ruin her perfect aesthetic. She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. She grabbed handfuls of her $15,000 lace gown, lifting the heavy fabric so she could move quickly. She abandoned her new husband at the head table and marched directly across the polished dance floor. Her face was flushed dark red with anger. Her jaw was clenched so tight, I thought her teeth might shatter. She intercepted me halfway across the ballroom, intentionally blocking my path. The guests at the surrounding tables fell completely silent, openly staring at the confrontation unfolding in the center of the room. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic, furious energy. She kept her tone low, trying to maintain the illusion of control, but her eyes were wild with panic. "I told you that you were an embarrassment. I specifically told you that your life is nothing to be proud of. I told you not to show up and ruin my day." I stopped walking. I looked down at the daughter I had quietly funded and protected for 28 years. She was trembling with rage, breathing heavily, entirely consumed by her own superficial pride. She cared more about the opinions of the strangers sitting in this room than she cared about her own flesh and blood. "I am not here to ruin your day, Sloane," I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of any paternal warmth. "I am here to give you your wedding gift." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Her eyes darted to my midnight blue tuxedo, looking at the fine silk and the perfect stitching. She sneered, convinced I had rented the clothes using the last of my meager savings, just to spite her and create a scene. I do not want anything from you, she spat, venom dripping from every single word. You do not belong in a place like this. You do not belong around these people. You are humiliating me, just by breathing the same air as Preston and his wealthy parents. She turned her head and snapped her fingers at a pair of venue security guards standing near the entrance. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, demanding their immediate attention. "Remove him," she ordered the guards, raising her voice just enough for the front rows of guests to hear. "This man is trespassing. He is not on the guest list. I want him thrown out right now." The two security guards exchanged an uncertain look. They stepped forward hesitantly, clearly intimidated by the sheer authority I was projecting. But before they could even reach for my arms, Mr. Hargrove stepped smoothly in front of me. He pulled a crisp white business card from his breast pocket and handed it directly to the senior guard. Mr. Hargrove spoke in a voice that carried the heavy weight of corporate dominance. He informed the guard that they were currently standing on a commercial property, heavily mortgaged, through a subsidiary of Callaway Commercial Real Estate. He suggested that before the guards made the catastrophic career mistake of touching the chief executive officer of their parent company, they might want to step back and remain entirely silent. The senior guard looked down at the business card, then looked up at the bespoke tuxedo and the absolute confidence radiating from both of us. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and quickly grabbed his partner by the shoulder. Both guards immediately stepped backward, melting away into the shadows near the wall, refusing to intervene. Sloane watched her security detail retreat in total disbelief. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The grand illusion of her control was cracking right in front of her eyes. She looked back at me, her arrogant fury warring with a sudden, creeping dread. She did not understand how a simple mechanic had just dismissed 2 trained security guards with a single business card. She did not understand why her worthless father was standing in a bespoke suit, looking like a billionaire holding court. I did not give her the time to process the shock. I simply stepped around her, leaving her frozen and speechless on the dance floor, and continued my steady walk toward the head table. I had a delivery to make, and the groom was sweating in his chair, desperately waiting for the truth to arrive. I left my daughter standing frozen on the dance floor and kept walking. The distance to the head table felt incredibly short. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The only sound left in the cavernous ballroom was the sharp, rhythmic click of my leather shoes against the polished marble floor. Preston sat at the center of the long, elaborate head table, flanked by his parents. His father, a man with a booming voice and a silver watch that cost more than a suburban house, was already standing up. His face was puffing with indignation, his chest thrown out in a display of wealthy arrogance. His mother clutched her expensive pearl necklace, staring at me as if a stray animal had just wandered into her exclusive dining room. They were ready to scold me. They were ready to put the dirty blue-collar mechanic right back in his place. But Preston did not stand up. Preston could barely breathe. He had been staring at his phone all morning, desperately refreshing his banking application, waiting for stolen corporate money to clear and save his life. When he looked up and saw me, the man he had screamed at in a greasy garage just 2 days ago, walking toward him, not in a faded flannel shirt, but in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, with the absolute unyielding authority of a man who owned the very ground he stood on, his brain completely short-circuited. He looked at my face, then at the heavy manila folder tucked firmly under Mr. Hargrove's arm. I reached the edge of the head table. Preston's father pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, loudly demanding to know who had let the help into the ballroom and threatening to have me arrested for trespassing. I did not even blink at him. I did not acknowledge his existence. I simply held my hand out to my side. Mr. Hargrove stepped forward and placed the thick sealed folder into my palm. I dropped it directly onto Preston's pristine white china plate. The heavy thud of the paper rattled the crystal water glasses and echoed across the silent room. I looked down at the groom, the sweating thief. I kept my voice low, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it carried with lethal clarity. I told him he had been waiting for a wire transfer to clear this morning. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. I told him the transfer was not going to clear. I told him the $150,000 he tried to steal from my company was frozen by federal authorities at 8 of this morning. Preston's father slammed his hand flat on the table, his face turning a furious shade of red. He shouted that I was a lunatic, demanding to know who I thought I was, to speak to his successful son that way, threatening to call the police and have me dragged out in chains. I finally turned my gaze to the arrogant man who had raised a criminal. I spoke in a voice that required no shouting, a voice forged in decades of ruthless corporate boardrooms. I told him, "My name is Everett Callaway." I told him, "I am the founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Callaway Commercial Real Estate." I told him that the company his son used to build his fake high society lifestyle belongs entirely to me. The color instantly vanished from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw hung open, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. The realization of what he had done, of who he had insulted, crashed down on him like a physical blow. His mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth with trembling hands. His father sputtered, the arrogant bluster completely knocked out of his lungs. The wealthy titan they had been boasting about all afternoon, the corporate giant they worshipped, was the very man they had been sneering at. Sloane had finally unfrozen from her spot on the dance floor. She rushed up behind me, breathless, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble. Tears of pure panic were pooling in her eyes. She looked at the heavy audit file resting on Preston's plate, then at the tailored tuxedo I was wearing, and then at Mr. Hargrove standing silently by my side. Her mind was desperately trying to bridge the massive gap between the worthless father she had thrown away and the billionaire standing in front of her. She stammered, her voice shaking, asking what was happening and what I had done to her perfect day. I turned slowly to look at my daughter. My expression was completely empty of sympathy. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her extravagant $15,000 lace dress. I looked at the panicked, greedy woman she had chosen to become. I reminded her of the exact words she had used when she blocked the door to her luxury apartment and banned me from this room. I told her. She said my life was nothing to be proud of. I told her. She said, I was a humiliating embarrassment who did not belong in her elite world. I pointed a single finger at the massive corporate audit file resting in front of her terrified criminal husband. I told her I just came to give her her wedding gift. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was suddenly broken by the sound of deliberate, heavy footsteps echoing from the main entrance. Everyone turned to look. The venue manager was marching across the polished marble floor, but he was no longer carrying his clipboard with a polite, accommodating smile. His face was pale and tight with anxiety. Walking directly behind him, with their hands resting firmly on their dark utility belts, were two uniformed police officers. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 high society guests. The soft murmurs escalated into a frantic buzzing sound as the officers cut a straight path through the sea of white floral arrangements, heading directly for the head table. The venue manager reached the table first. He did not apologize for the interruption, and he did not lower his voice to preserve the dignity of the event. He looked directly at Preston and stated that the massive wire transfer initiated that morning had been officially flagged and seized by federal authorities. He announced to the entire room that the country club had not received a single dollar for the reception. He declared that the event was entirely unpaid, and effective immediately, the wedding celebration was permanently canceled. Before Preston could even open his mouth to fabricate another lie, the two police officers stepped around the manager. They asked Preston to confirm his identity, but it was a mere formality. One officer firmly grabbed Preston's shoulder, forcing him to stand up from his chair, while the other officer pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The officer began to read Preston his rights. His voice was loud and authoritative, echoing across the silent, terrified ballroom. He stated that Preston was being placed under arrest for corporate embezzlement and multiple counts of federal wire fraud. Preston tried to pull his arm away, stammering that there was a massive misunderstanding and that he was a senior executive who could clear this up with a simple phone call. But his resistance only made the officers move faster and with far less patience. The cold, sharp click of the metal handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He was completely trapped, stripped of his arrogant facade, and reduced to a sweating, trembling criminal in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. Preston's father suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed shock. He lunged forward, puffing out his chest and demanding that the officers unhand his son immediately. He shouted that they were ruining a private high society function and threatened to call the authorities to have their badges stripped by morning. He insisted his son was a brilliant, wealthy man who did not need to steal a single dime from anyone. Mr. Hargrove did not let the officers waste their breath, explaining the situation. He stepped calmly into the chaos and extended a copy of the finalized corporate audit directly into the father's chest. Hargrove suggested that before the man made a fool of himself defending a felon, he should review the bank routing numbers and the forged offshore accounts listed on page 4. He told the father that his brilliant, wealthy son had been funding his entire life with stolen money, and that the federal government already had every digital footprint they needed to lock him away for a very long time. Preston's father looked down at the documents, his eyes scanning the undeniable proof of his son's guilt. the arrogant bluster completely drained from his body, leaving him looking small and incredibly old. His mother let out a loud, humiliated sob, hiding her face behind her hands as she realized her entire social standing was collapsing in real time. They stepped back, watching helplessly as the officers marched their handcuffed son away from the head table and paraded him straight through the center of the grand ballroom. As the officers led Preston down the center aisle, he kept his head bowed. The people he had bragged to, the colleagues he had belittled, and the socialites he had worshipped were now pulling out their phones to record his humiliating downfall. The 200 guests began to stand up from their tables, grabbing their expensive coats and heading for the exits, not wanting to be associated with a federal crime scene. I turned my attention away from the thief and looked at my daughter. Sloane was completely shattered. She was trembling violently, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She looked at the empty chair where her wealthy, successful groom had been sitting just moments ago. Then she looked at the heavy manila folder resting on the table, realizing that the criminal she had chosen to marry had just destroyed her entire future. Finally, she looked at me. She looked at the bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, the calm authority in my posture, and the financial titan standing by my side. The horrific, devastating truth finally pieced itself together in her mind. She realized that the anonymous academic grants, the subsidized luxury apartment, and the flawless safety net she had enjoyed her entire life had never been a stroke of luck. It had all been me. She had looked the multi-million-dollar source of her entire existence in the eye, called his life worthless, and banned him from her wedding because his work boots offended her superficial aesthetic. She realized that she had no money to pay the venue manager standing over her. She had no home to return to because her lease was canceled. She had no husband to provide for her. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed backward into a heavy wooden dining chair, the layers of her $15,000 lace dress spilling uselessly across the floor. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep, not with sadness, but with the soul-crushing realization of her own catastrophic arrogance. She had traded a father who would have given her the world for a lying thief who had just taken everything she had left. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer her a shoulder to cry on. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my suit, looked at the absolute ruins of her perfect high society facade, and turned my back on the wreckage. I walked out of the grand ballroom with slow, measured steps, leaving her to sit completely alone in the mess she had so desperately demanded. 7 days had passed since the grand ballroom emptied out. The dust had completely settled. I was back in my driveway, sweeping the concrete, enjoying the quiet hum of a Tuesday morning. There were no more board meetings and no frantic financial calls. There was just the sound of the broom and the distant chirping of birds. For me, the storm was entirely over. For my daughter, the hurricane was just making landfall. A dented economy sedan pulled up to the curb. It was a cheap, budget rideshare service, which was a stark contrast to the gleaming luxury vehicles she usually demanded. The passenger door opened, and Sloane stepped out. She looked completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was tied back in a messy, tangled knot. Her expensive designer clothes had been replaced by wrinkled sweatpants and a baggy sweater. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen and red from days of nonstop crying. The reality of a life without my invisible safety net had hit her with the force of a runaway freight train. She walked up the driveway with heavy, dragging steps. When she reached the edge of my garage, she did not look at my work boots with disgust. Instead, she collapsed onto her knees right there on the concrete, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. She wept loudly, letting out a desperate, hollow sound that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I did not rush forward to pick her up. I did not offer her a shoulder to cry on. I simply leaned my broom against the wall and waited for her to speak. She looked up at me, with tears streaming down her face, and her voice trembling. She told me she had absolutely nothing left. She said the landlord had officially changed the locks on her luxury penthouse that morning, and her belongings were sitting in trash bags in the lobby. Her high society friends had completely stopped answering her phone calls the moment the news of the federal arrest broke. Her bank accounts were frozen, and her credit cards were declined everywhere. Then came the desperate demands, disguised as pleas. She begged me to turn the trust fund back on. She pleaded with me to hire my high-powered corporate lawyers to bail Preston out of federal custody. She cried that he was a good man who just made a foolish mistake because he wanted to give her the perfect wedding she deserved. She told me that with my billions of dollars, I could easily make the criminal charges disappear and fix their ruined lives. I looked down at the daughter who had banished me from her life. She was not apologizing for her cruelty. She was not apologizing for looking me in the eye and calling my life worthless. She was only apologizing because she had run out of money. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I told her that Preston was a felon who deliberately stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company, and he was exactly where he belonged. I told her the trust fund was permanently dissolved, and the money had already been redirected to charitable foundations. Panic flashed in her swollen eyes. When she realized the tears were not melting my resolve, she pivoted to the cruelest weapon she had left in her arsenal. She stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees, and her voice turned sharp and accusatory. She invoked the name of my late wife. She told me that her mother would be absolutely disgusted by my behavior. She cried that Rosalind had loved her unconditionally, and that her mother would never have allowed me to throw my own flesh and blood out onto the street. She screamed that I was betraying Rosalind's memory by abandoning her only child in her darkest hour. She tried to use my profound grief over losing the love of my life as a crowbar to pry open my wallet. Hearing her weaponize her mother's memory did not break my heart. It only forged my resolve into unbreakable steel. I looked her dead in the eye and spoke with a quiet, lethal certainty. I told her that her mother and I built our empire by working multiple grueling jobs and eating cheap canned soup just to keep the lights on in our first tiny apartment. I told her that Rosalind valued integrity, hard work, and humility above absolutely everything else in this world. I looked at Sloane and told her that if her mother were standing in this driveway today and saw the shallow, greedy, arrogant woman she had chosen to become, Rosalind would be the one locking the door. The color completely drained from Sloane's face. The manipulative anger vanished, replaced by a cold, horrifying realization. She finally understood that there were no more buttons left to push. There were no more emotional strings to pull. The endless well of parental forgiveness she had exploited her entire life was permanently dry. She stood there trembling in the driveway of the house she had always despised, realizing that her blue-collar father was the only true wealth she had ever possessed, and she had thrown him away for a criminal who left her with absolutely nothing. I looked at her standing there on the concrete driveway. The silence between us stretched out long and heavy. She expected me to break. She expected the old fatherly instinct to kick in, the one that always rushed to put a bandage on her scraped knees when she was a little girl. But that man was completely gone. I stood in the doorway of my home, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hard finality. My posture was absolute steel. I did not shift my weight. I did not cross my arms defensively. I simply existed in the space she had tried so hard to push me out of. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her oversized sweater. She tried to step forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward my arm. She whispered that she was my daughter. She asked where she was supposed to go tonight. She asked how she was supposed to eat or survive without the trust fund and without the luxury apartment. She said she was terrified of the world without a safety net. I did not step back, but I did not let her touch me either. I looked at her reaching hand and then up to her swollen red eyes. I told her that she was a 28-year-old adult. I told her that millions of people wake up every single day and go to work to put a roof over their heads and food on their tables. I said it was finally time for her to join the real world. I told her she would survive the exact same way her mother and I did before we built the empire she took for granted. She would have to earn it. She would have to sweep floors or wait tables or file papers, just like everyone else. She shook her head desperately, letting out another hollow sob. She asked how I could be so cruel to her. She asked how a father could just turn his back on his own family and leave them with absolutely nothing. I kept my voice perfectly level. I did not raise it a single decibel. I told her that I was not being cruel. I was just giving her exactly what she asked for. You measured my worth by what you thought was in my wallet. You asked me to stay out of your life because I embarrassed you. I am simply honoring your request. Her jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to argue, to find another angle, another manipulative excuse, to weave another lie. But I did not give her the chance. I turned around for a brief moment and reached into the entryway of my house. Sitting on the small wooden bench was a single plain cardboard box. I had packed it early this morning, before the sun even came up. Inside were the last remaining remnants of the girl I used to know. A few framed photographs from her childhood, her old soccer trophies from middle school, and the hand-painted macaroni necklaces she used to make me for Father's Day. It was the physical evidence of a daughter who no longer existed in this world. I turned back around and extended the cardboard box toward her. She took it automatically, her hands clutching the brown cardboard as if she did not quite understand what it was. I told her these were her things. I told her there was absolutely nothing left for her in this house anymore. I stepped backward over the threshold and pulled the heavy front door toward me. She stood frozen in the driveway, clutching the box of her past to her chest. She did not scream. She did not try to push her way inside. She just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, as the reality of her choices finally settled over her like a suffocating blanket. I looked at her one last time and pushed the door shut. The heavy wood closed with a solid, resounding thud that vibrated through the floorboards. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click of the lock sliding into place echoed in the quiet entryway. It was the sharp, definitive sound of a toxic tie being severed forever. I did not look out the peephole to watch her cry. I did not stand by the front window to see how long it took for her budget rideshare to arrive and take her away. I simply turned my back on the front door, walked into my kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and sat down at the table. The house was perfectly quiet. The air felt incredibly clean. The longest chapter of my life was finally over. 6 months passed, bringing a quiet but absolute shift to the world. The seasons changed, and so did the reality of the people who once thought they owned everything. Preston did not get the luxury of a country club prison. The federal judge was not moved by his arrogant excuses. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal facility for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. There were no tailored suits in his cell, just a standard uniform and a long stretch of time to think about the life he destroyed with his own greed. As for my daughter, the harsh light of reality finally forced her to wake up. Without my invisible safety net funding her luxury life, she had to face the actual cost of living in the real world. I heard through the grapevine that her high society friends completely abandoned her the moment the money dried up. She was forced to take a minimum wage retail job, folding clothes and dealing with demanding customers for 8 hours a day. She takes the public bus to a small rented room far away from the elite downtown zip codes. It is a grueling, humbling existence, but it is the exact education she always needed. She is finally learning the true value of a single hard-earned dollar without anyone there to rescue her. I do not check up on her, and I do not feel any bitterness in my heart. The anger that fueled my actions completely burned away, leaving behind a profound, quiet peace. I spent decades working to build an empire, and then I spent another decade hiding from it. Now I am finally using it exactly how my late wife and I always dreamed we would. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, and I was standing in front of a massive, newly constructed brick building in the heart of our town. The fresh paint gleamed in the sunlight, and the happy sounds of children laughing echoed from the playground out back. Over the main double doors, a beautiful bronze plaque read the Rosalind Calloway Youth Community Center. I had fully funded the project, stepping out of the corporate shadows just enough to make sure my wife's legacy was permanently set in stone. She always believed in giving kids a safe place to learn and grow, and now her dream was a physical reality. I was not standing there alone. I was surrounded by people who knew my name, but did not care about the size of my bank account. Nora, my kind, elderly neighbor, was standing right beside me, holding a tray of her famous oatmeal cookies to share with the neighborhood kids. Mr. Hargrove even came down from the corporate office, trading his sharp suit for a comfortable sweater, just to see the grand opening. They smiled at me, treating me not as a billionaire chief executive, but simply as a good friend and an honest man. They respected my character, and that meant more to me than any corporate portfolio ever could. The afternoon sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the brand new building. I said my goodbyes to Nora and the rest of the community board, feeling a deep warmth in my chest. I walked across the freshly paved parking lot toward my old classic Chevy truck. I did not trade it in for a luxury sedan. I still loved the smell of the motor oil and the familiar rumble of the engine. I climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the worn leather against my back, and rolled the windows all the way down. I turned the key, and the heavy engine roared to life with a steady, powerful heartbeat. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the parking lot, heading straight into the sunset. The cool evening breeze washed over my face, carrying away the very last remnants of the past. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the balance in your bank account or the designer labels on your clothes. Real wealth is found in the quiet dignity of an honest life and the courage to demand respect, even from those who share your blood. We often confuse unconditional love with endless tolerance, allowing toxic family members to drain our spirit simply because they are family. But walking away from manipulation and greed is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot buy character, and you can never save someone who only values you for what they can take from you. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button. Share your own experiences with toxic family dynamics in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power.